welcome everyone. My name is Gina Bone. I am the co-founder along with Alex Neal of Downtown Women for Change. And I'll be serving as your host tonight because with my fellow board member, Sally Greenspan. Sally.
Hi.
And Rachel Curry, who you see, Rachel. She is managing our tech tonight. So if you have any problems, throw them into the chat and Rachel will help you deal with them. Another DWC board member, Kira Berry, was supposed to be Sally's co-host tonight, not me. But she had a family emergency. And earlier today, her son had surgery for a sports injury. So Kira, when you listen to this as a recording, all your sisters at DWC are sending our very best wishes for his speedy recovery. Now, in the past, DWC has held general meetings to inform our members on a variety of topics impacting women. Women and guns, reproductive rights in New York State. We are so pleased you've joined us tonight for what is really like a virtual general meeting, our first. Since the COVID era began. And this meeting is in anticipation of a very important and consequential election for New York City. Okay, all elections are consequential. It's like lives in an ecosystem. Every life has cascading effects on every other life. So likewise, every election has cascading effects. The primaries on June 22nd are to elect mayor, Comptroller, borough presidents, and city council members, lots of city council members. Many of the current holders of these positions are term limited, so there'll be lots of new faces for us to learn. And add to that, the city, the residents, that's you and me, the employees, employers, and elected leaders, all of us, we face pressures from the pandemic that, frankly, we can expect to be ongoing in one way or another. Our purpose tonight is to get everyone invested in the local elections in 2021. And tonight we want to show that we can influence not just political races, which we've done in the past, but legislation, the allocation of our tax dollars, and party platform. So for those of you that don't know us, Downtown Women for Change is a grassroots organization that was founded by New York women after the 2016 presidential election, like right after, like the next day. We are committed to preserving and advancing women's rights, supporting women and girls in the United States, and working to elect progressive pro-choice women and allies to political office. And, we've done a hell of a job doing that so far. So now I'm going to pass the baton to Sally Greenspan and let's get the show rolling.
Okay, well, thank you, Gina, and welcome again, everybody, to DWC and our New York City Government 101 presentation. As Gina said, 2021 is a very big election year in New York City. For everyone from mayor to the city council, many elections are happening this year, and your votes are going to determine the winners. And for the first time ever, New Yorkers will be voting via ranked choice voting. This webinar should help you try to understand and clarify more the role of each of our different elected officials in the administration of our city and introduce you to the concept of ranked choice voting. There's going to be two parts to tonight's program. The first is a 20-minute slide and talk describing the structure of New York City government. The presentation was put together by Gina, who you just met. Gina is an author, a lecturer at the New York Botanical Gardens, and the co-founder of DWC. Beatrice Buchanan DeStephanis is an undergraduate at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, and she's studying politics and sociology. And Deborah Keats, who is also a DWC member and professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Assisting this group were Beth Krieger and Leslie Gersing, DWC members who supported the hard work of editing and proofreading the slide presentation, and we thank them for that. Beatrice will be managing the slideshow and Deborah will narrate. The program design is simple and straightforward, only 17 slides, but they're very elegant in representing what is often pretty boggy material. Gina will maintain the chat where she will refer your questions to government news and other websites for further details. So during the slideshow, please send any questions to Gina in the chat room. We won't be taking questions audibly for this part. After the event, we will email the program and a curated list of our sources to DWC members. Then following this portion of the program, Sally Goldenberg, City Hall Bureau Chief of Politico in New York, will share some insight as to how things really work. And now the slideshow ladies, take it away.
Yeah.
So our task is to introduce a little bit about the way New York City government works and to make all of you maybe more familiar than you are with some of the positions that we elect and then some of the ways in which those elected officials govern our daily lives. So start out with a basic definition. Democracies and republics are forms of government in which the public, and this is important, the public funds, elects, and consents to be governed by representatives and their appointed bureaucracies. This is a quote from Jefferson's first inaugural, right? I'm just going to put it up there while I talk, but you might want to read it and sort of notice from the beginning, right? That government has in the US anyway, government has the privilege and the responsibility to legislate and to regulate activities and behaviors that pertain to the welfare of the public good. They are elected and paid to provide public goods and services paid for by taxes and other levies. So, while to a large extent voters abdicate decisions to their representatives, they retain the right and the responsibility to know where and how the representatives they elect make decisions and to advise and influence those decisions through political advocacy. The key point we're going to try to make with this presentation is to show how the back and forth between voters, their elected representatives, and the bureaucracies appointed by these representatives is written into the structure of New York City government. This opportunity and obligation to advise and influence is embedded in the structure of the government, of the New York City government by the charter, which splits governing bodies into branches, we'll talk more about that later, that check and balance one another's work. In New York City, public input is solicited when the two branches, or New York's public input is especially solicited when the two branches, the executive and the legislative branches, are obliged to negotiate with one another. In other words, we want to show you a pattern of the way in which influence is structured into the form of government that we have in the city. Some of this information is going to appear densely populated at times, and we're not, this is really a 101 thing. What we're trying to do with this densely, maybe too densely populated information is to give you a visual impression, especially about the density of the centralized government that makes up New York City, as well as the places in which there are opportunities for public input. And as Sally said, the script, the slides, and the collection of links will be mailed out, we think, to attendees and to DWC members. But the purpose that we were asked to do, we'll see if we do it, but our purpose was to get everybody excited about the local elections in 2021, because we have the ability as voters and as an up and coming pressure group, right? Group of influencers, to influence government action through our selection of leadership, an influence that continues beyond campaigning and voting for our representatives. All right, so we're going to move on from Jefferson. So Jefferson's sum of good government has taken many forms. And the reason that I've got the UN's 8 principles of good government up here is because the question about what good government meant became increasingly a debate in political theory and in government circles after the deregulation in the 1980s. So we're starting with these principles that have mostly been articulated by international agencies like the IMF and the UN to remind us that even though as voters, again, we abdicate, the function of our government requires that we abdicate most of our immediate hands-on governing to our elected representatives, that government in the US and in New York City nonetheless is responsive. It has to be responsive, transparent, effective, and accountable to the residents, to the to the electors, to the voters, to the citizens, to everybody who lives in the country that participates in this form of government. The other thing we want to know, so that's what these are up here for, right? It's just to remind you that the system of good governance requires participation, rule of law, has to be consensus oriented, asks for transparency, asks for equity and inclusivity, asks for effectiveness, asks for accountability and responsiveness. And we put this up here before we jump into the bureaucratic structure of the government itself. The other thing that we want to note is that groups tend to have more influence than individuals. And that's one of the ways in which groups like DWC can and should organize themselves to play this ongoing role. All right, so New York City. New York City has what's called a mayor council system, which means that voters elect both the mayor and the city council. New York is judged to be a strong mayor system with a highly centralized government structure. What that means is that in New York City, the mayor is able to veto the actions of the council, to appoint and fire heads of city departments, and to produce a budget. Under a weak mayoral system, which is a system that some cities have, the mayor has less authority. They mostly serve as in a ceremonial capacity as a spokesperson for the city. In New York City, the city government, using taxpayer money, hires a strong and deep administration who have the opportunity to decide and manage decisions about services and regulations that affect key parts of the city. And for example, these are the key parts of the decisions that affect the city, that the city government manages. So you can read them: clean water, sewage, garbage disposal, parks and facilities, streetlights and stadiums, zoning, and so forth. City governments, right, define, legislate, regulate, and administer public goods and services that pertain to the needs of city residents. To pay for these services and goods, the administrations that sustain and the administrations that sustain them, the city relies on property tax revenue, user fees from trash collection, the provision of water and sewer services, and a portion of sales tax receipts and taxes on business. In other words, city governments provide goods and services relative to a budget which is created from the collection of taxes and other levies. New York City's government, much like the federal government, is divided into three branches. Right? There's the executive, which is the mayor and a whole list of other people that we'll get to in a minute. There's the legislative branch, which is mostly the city council, and there are the courts, the judicial branch, which are the courts and the DAs. Voters, and we want to stress this, voters elect some of this leadership, but the vast majority, as you'll see in the next slide, the vast majority of the positions of the people who actually make the day-to-day decisions are appointed by the elected officials. So B made us this beautiful dense graph. And we've got it color coded to show you the difference between the people in red are the people that we vote for, that voters vote for. The positions in the offices and the officers who would head up these positions in gray are the people who are appointed by the elected officials, what I'm calling the bureaucracy. Everybody from the mayor to the left of the slide is part of the executive branch. The city council is the legislative branch, the district attorneys and the courts on the right are the judicial branch. So for tonight, we're mostly going to ignore the judicial branch. We're just going to note that it's made up of elected district attorneys and civil court judges and New York Supreme Court judges. But what we're going to focus on instead is what strong centralization means, especially in the executive branch. We're trying to offer a first impression of the depth of the appointed bureaucracy, the extent to which daily and long-term decisions are made by appointed professionals who more or less work for the mayor, i.e. for the executive branch. And then also we want to point to those moments in which the central decision-making is open to oversight and to public influence. So as you can see from this chart, most of the executive branch is appointed and tasked with professional administration of city services and goods. But there's a pattern to the way in which, even with these series of appointments, there's a pattern in which, by virtue of the city charter, oversight is part of. We voters don't have influence because people are nice to us. We voters have influence because the structure of oversight and influence is written into the structure of our city government. So there are several pairings that provide a pattern of oversight that we want you to notice. Let's move to the next slide, please. There we go. So the first pairing we're going to talk about are the public advocate and the mayor. So for example, the office of the public advocate, which was created, it's a new office, it was created by the Charter Revision of 1989, is a citywide elected position. The public advocate serves as a non-voting member of the city council who has oversight on the mayor's office as ombudsman for the city government, providing oversight for city agencies, investigating citizens' complaint. They serve on committees which select the director of the New York City Independent Budget Office and appoint members to several boards and commissions, including one of the members of the New York City Planning Commission. And in the event of a vacancy or an incapacity of the mayor, the public advocate is the first in line to become the mayor. So while public safety, chancellor, deputy mayors, press secretary, and all the bureaucracy underneath them are appointed by the mayor, the public advocate has oversight of all of this activity in all of these agencies and serves as the ombudsman on behalf of the public. A similar pairing for a different level or function of the government is the Comptroller and the Independent Budget Office. So the Office of the Comptroller and the Independent Budget Office share broadly a similar set of obligations. They're both technically part of the executive branch, but they serve different functions and they have different obligations. The Comptroller is elected to oversee and to regulate the financial management of the executive branch's work through a large appointed staff who report to him or her. The IBO is appointed, but their mandate is to do research and to support nonpartisan fact-based information about the costs, implications, and future outlooks for whatever the government administration produces and for the public. So both these pairings, the pairing of the public advocate and the mayor, and the pairing of the Comptroller and the Independent Budget Office, are examples of the way in which the structure of city government delivers on its obligation to go back to our UN principles, to be responsive, transparent, effective, and accountable to the public, again, as required by the city charter. The split between the functions of borough presidents and the community boards is similar, except that they are also more directly bridge the gap between the executive and the legislative branches. So let's move on to the next. So in this slide, we're fudging it a little bit because only the borough presidents are technically part of the executive branch. The community boards are not, but we have them paired here because what we're trying to show is the way in which they work together. So the borough presidents are elected to represent and advocate for the residents of boroughs, advising, you can't see me, but I've got that in scare quotes, advising on specific borough issues, mostly land use or zoning and budget prioritization. They represent their constituents' needs to the executive and the legislative branches, and they negotiate on behalf, but they're part technically of the executive branch, which means they report to the mayor. The needs and wishes of the borough constituents are communicated through the community boards. And that's why we have them on the slide, even though technically they're not part of the executive branch. So community boards exist in the various communities in the city. I think there are 51. I don't have it on my notes. I meant to have that. We'll check that later. It'll be in the notes that Gina's posting. So there are 51 community boards, the community boards, and I didn't know this, for example, before I started doing this research. Community board members volunteer their time. They're not paid, but they are appointed. Half of them are appointed by the borough presidents and half of them are nominated by the city council members. So they are part of the political process, even though they are volunteer members from their local communities whose job is to organize the meetings of the community boards to report back and to receive input from local members of the community. So the community boards function as an organized form of outreach to advise and influence and to gather information and to create buy-in for city policies and city budget decisions. These forums are opportunities, or what we're calling pressure points, for public and special interest group input. And we're trying to distinguish here to underscore the special interest groups are more often influential than individuals or temporary coalitions, right? We're not saying that interest groups are not what we are. We are interest groups. We can become interest groups. Pressure points allow activists, either groups or individuals, to be heard on decisions negotiated between the executive and the legislative branches. But there's a twist. So community boards are autonomous and they can say what they want and do what they want, but their purpose is outreach. And like the borough presidents, the way the charter puts it is that they're only permitted or allowed to quote unquote encourage and facilitate, to pass judgment or to advise, especially on land use issues and budgeting and services provided, which means that they may or may not be influential on the decisions of the executive and legislative branches. And more likely, right, and we're hoping that Sally will tell us this in the next section, it seems that this input is likely to be balanced in these negotiations between the legislative and the executive branches when they're negotiating on the creation of the budget and the creation of legislation. So we're going to switch to show how we're going to switch to the legislative branch. That's next, sorry. So the legislative branch is the city council. And what we have here is a 2018 map. It's a little bit out of date, but what we want to do is just give you a graphic of the way that the districts are set up. This is a post 2014, they were rearranged. They will be rearranged again in 2022 after the data from the 2020 census has been processed. But for the moment and for this election, this is the outline. And in the notes, or in the chat notes, there's a link that will take you to a more recent listing of the actual city council members, and that will also show you which 34 of the 51 seats are up for re-election in 2021. So the way the city council is organized, we're going to switch to the city council leadership. Right? So this is the way the city council is organized, right? That they elect a speaker, a majority leader, a minority leader, and what they do, right? Their fundamental jobs are to introduce and vote on legislation, to negotiate with the budget with the mayor, to monitor city agencies such as the Department of Education, and to review land use or zoning and make decisions about growth and development. Only members of city council can produce new bills. Go back a second, we're not yet there yet, sorry. City council members can produce new bills. Most of the legislative work in the city council is done through committees. Now we're to the committees. Sorry about that, B. So city council members are assigned to committees, and their work of managing legislation and of overlooking and overseeing budget propositions or proposals happen on these committees. They are voted once they're in the council. The council votes to assign the committee positions. Committees meet every other month, and they're tasked with these areas of responsibilities. In addition, city council members have the opportunity to join caucuses. And these caucuses, right now, there are 5 caucuses: the Black, Latino, and Asian caucus, the Jewish caucus, the Progressive caucus, the Women's caucus, the Black, Latino, and Asian caucus, the Jewish caucus, the LGBT caucus, the Progressive caucus, and the Women's caucus. So these are caucuses that meet with the community, the council members who elect to be on them. And this is another specifically direct point of pressure. So caucuses, like community boards, are direct points of pressure where the council can be lobbied by individuals and by groups with special interests. So we're next going to move to 2 examples of the places in which lobbying is influential on key decisions that affect first the budget and then the laws. So we're going to switch to the budget. So the budget follows a calendar of follows a calendar of negotiations, right? The mayor or the mayor's office and the mayor's bureaucracy proposes an expense and capital budget in consultation with the borough presidents and the controller. That budget is submitted to the city council for review. The city council is allowed to adapt or modify or amend or propose amendments. The city council, in the process of considering the mayor's budget proposals, holds public hearings, and in response to those public hearings submits a revised budget back to the mayor. And then the mayor and the city council negotiate and agree upon an adopted budget by July 1st. The main point here is that there's a process of negotiation, that the executive branch is tasked with the production of the proposed budget and with the details of the proposed budget, but the city council is allowed to question, to change and amend, and to finally approve or disapprove in the process of negotiation. And it's at the moment at which that happens, it's the moment at which the city council is functioning in its oversight capacity, that it holds public hearings and it solicits public information. There's a similar structure in the way that laws are created and enacted. So in this case, legislation originates with the city council. Members of the city council are allowed to introduce a bill. That bill is referred to the committees. The committees themselves hold public hearings at which public opinion is solicited. That committee vote is then sent to the mayor. If it's passed by the majority of the committee, by the whole council, it's passed on to the mayor. The mayor then holds his own set of public hearings, or the executive branch holds their own set of public hearings. And then the mayor chooses to sign or veto the bill. And depending on what the mayor decides to do, that bill becomes law, or it goes back to the council for further negotiation. So I don't want to belabor this too much because I don't want to wear out or exhaust your attention. The main point we're trying to make is that city council and the mayor put together, that they use their bureaucracies to generate the content of the budget of legislation, but they are required, and they do have moments of outreach and public hearings and consultation through the community boards at which information and input from the public can and does influence the final outcome, both of the budget and of the legislation. So that's the basic pattern we want to show. So far, everything we've talked about have been organizations or groups within the city budget. Sorry, within the city government. Apologies, right? We want to point out one more kind of form of organization, which are the democratic political clubs, which are an organized form of influence on the outcomes and on the people who hold those city offices. So political clubs, and especially what most of our research was on, was democratic political clubs. They're outside of the government, and they are often seats of power for elected officials. Members of clubs vote on which political and judicial candidates they want to endorse and they want to support, mostly through outreach to voters, through fundraising, through district and through district fundraising, through door-to-door petitioning, through voter outreach, right? Democratic political clubs also elect district leaders. District leaders from New York City political clubs make up the executive board of each county's Democratic County Committee. Many members of the political clubs are also general members of the Democratic County Committee, who play an important role in choosing a candidate to fill an unexpected vacancy in elected official seats. Democratic political clubs elect the state committee membership, which helps set and determine statewide candidates, and they run in primary elections to be judicial delegates who nominate the Democratic candidates for the New York City Supreme Court judge positions. Democratic political clubs are things that anybody can join, right? I mean, you would join your local political club, and in the notes you'll see places that if you're interested in this, you can go be pointed to where you can find a local Democratic political club. And that is because outside the political process, or you're outside the official political process, anybody who wants to join can become an influential member of their local political party and can influence who will become Democratic nominees, and presumably therefore, since New York mostly elects Democrats, Democratic politicians, democratically elected politicians. There has been some concern over the control that parties exercise on the process of electing officials through endorsements and through other forms of financial support. And that's where ranked choice voting comes in. So the last thing that we've been asked to introduce is ranked choice voting in New York City. So in November 2019, 74% of voters who voted to approve the switch to ranked choice voting for New York City elections. So ranked choice voting was established to decrease the influence of party leadership. So precisely, in a way, it's a pushback against the Democratic political clubs and the Democratic Party's choices over who it is that's going to govern. So our ranked choice voting has gained popularity in the US because winning candidates increasingly win elections despite being opposed by a plurality of voters. And an example is Maine, and we can point you to the example in Maine in the notes. Even in elections with clear majority winners, research has found that voters often claim to settle for candidates that their party leadership endorsed as likely winners for fear of being spoilers, and i.e. handing over the election to the opposition party. Ranked choice voting in New York City this year means that voters will be able to select and to rank their top 5 choices for mayor, controller, public advocate, borough president, and members of the city council. So instead of voting for one choice, you'll vote for 5 choices and you'll rank them 1 through 5. If no candidate wins a clear majority for any one of these positions, there's a process for redistributing the votes of the lowest ranked, of the lowest vote getter, and of continually redistributing the votes until there is a clear winner with a clear majority, more than 50% of the vote. So you can see the benefits that ranked choice voting is supposed to, go back a second, will you just, oh, thank you. You can see that these are the benefits, right? It's gonna be chosen by the majority. It's gonna discourage negative campaigning. It's gonna allow voters to vote for their preferences. It's going to encourage candidates to get beyond their typical base of supporters and to do outreach to everybody. And it's going to save money by preventing costly and inconvenient runoffs. And we have, again, links in our chat that will send you to more information about ranked choice voting, how it works, and how you can get involved with it. So there's more to say on this, but what we wanted to just give you was a general overview, let's call it, of the opportunities that groups like WC have to influence legislative and budget decisions, and the extent to which leadership must create outreach to create outreach. Our hope in this crucial year is that you will choose ways and places to voice your concerns and to put efficient pressure on various parts of the system that may assure that our agendas all get addressed. Knowing how pressure points work and who influences whom is what we think the next speaker, Sally, is going to tell us about. And thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Deborah, Gina, and Beatrice. That was fabulous. And I now have the privilege of introducing our very special guest, Sally Goldenberg, who is the City Hall Bureau Chief for Politico New York. Sally joined the Politico team in 2013 to cover Mayor Bill de Blasio's administration. She has been focused on budgets, labor contracts, city housing, and economic development. Prior to Politico, Sally worked for the New York Post, covering the New York City Council and former Mayor Michael Bloomberg's administration. She's a native of New Jersey, a graduate of Rutgers University, and now she lives in Brooklyn, New York. Any questions for Sally, please put them in the question area of the webinar. You can also put them in the chat, but primarily in the question area. We will be taking questions for Sally audibly when she's finished talking. Deborah and Gina will be working on going through the questions to pose to Sally. So please put them in there as she goes along. Welcome, Sally, you're on.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Thanks for the introduction. So I thought I would start tonight by talking a little bit about the city's COVID response, because that's, something that's obviously going on right now. And I think it's very illustrative of the power dynamics in the city. So we've probably all seen Mayor de Blasio does a briefing, every day or every few days to tell people what his administration is doing with regard to the COVID response. And there have been a few inflection points over the past 10 months that kind of show the extent and limits of his power. So, in the early months, he was at war with his health department, which was sort of a strange and kind of interesting story for us to cover in the media, because you don't really see things like that happen very often. It's interesting because he obviously appoints, as has been mentioned, the mayor appoints pretty much every commissioner in city government. The city council has a say in one position, the Department of Investigation commissioner. And I think because of a charter amendment recently, the council will have say in the head of the law department. But by and large, all of these agencies, Department of Transportation, Housing, Public Housing, et cetera, the mayor appoints them, and that's that, which is one of the many ways in which it is a strong mayor form of government. But through the press and the city council, the disagreements between the mayor and his health department became so kind of big and unignorable that he had to force his health commissioner out in the middle of a pandemic. It was highly unusual. And I think it goes to show one limit on mayoral power is the action of the city council. the council is by design not terribly powerful, but what they have is a bully pulpit. They can, of course, they have to pass the city budget, and we can get into that later, but the bully pulpit of the council and the fact that these members can all reach out to the press and, put quotes in stories, have oversight hearings. There was just one, I think, today on the vaccine rollout. It draws attention to problems in city government that make it such that, a mayor who otherwise has, much, much more, not unilateral power, but much more power, has to sort of acquiesce to these 51 elected legislators. So I thought that was a good example of, a sort of a limit, not structurally, but just in practicality, a limit on the mayor's power. And the other one that is a much sort of more consistent example is the governor. For as powerful as the mayor is, he or maybe one day she, although it's never been a she, he is dwarfed in power hugely by the position of governor. And we've all seen this nonstop back and forth between Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo. Predates the COVID response, but it's really peaked because it's sort of, I think, surprising to many people that these two politicians can't really get together and agree on anything during a major health crisis like this. And the reasons for that are pretty extensive, but to keep it simple, the governor has much more money and pretty much decides how city regulations will be put into effect. So, the vaccine distribution is the most recent example. The city can't just say, here, we want to distribute this number of vaccines on this day at this hospital, and this is our budget and our money, and we're going to do it. Everything is dictated by state regulations. And as if that weren't enough to make the job of mayor kind of difficult, there are, political and personal dynamics, particularly between these two individuals, that kind of constantly cut de Blasio's ability to govern effectively down. So I think what you've seen, for anyone who's paid attention to how the city has carried out the COVID response, it has kind of been a civics lesson, of the extent and limits of the power of the mayoralty. And it's something that comes up, and I wanted to get to the 2021 elections in a few minutes, but it is something that comes up frequently when candidates are campaigning for office. Is they say things like, well, I could get along better with the governor, because they understand, I think, that it's problematic, when lives are on the line. It's just very problematic to have this constant, stalemate between the two. So that is sort of, I think, a good overview of how the mayor governs and how he, sort of the limits on that. And excuse me, and that also raises the role of the city council, which, is also being not reelected. I'm sorry, the positions are all open this year, and most of them are leaving because of term limits. So there's 51 members. I think 2/3 are term limited out. 1/3 is running for reelection, roughly. And the council, by comparison to the mayor, is fairly limited in power, but they have the ability to approve the budget, and they have the ability, like I said, to hold these oversight hearings and really draw attention to things that are going on in the city. So a few years ago, there was a lot of attention around public housing, and the news was the press was covering it, and the federal government got involved. But the city council would hold these oversight hearings, and they'd have residents and tenant leaders, and it would just be, it would elevate the issue beyond anything that they could do, almost through legislation. Like, as I said before, that bully pulpit they have, and the attention that they're able to address or put on an issue is pretty vast and pretty important for anybody who wants to get attention for a particular special interest. So that's, I think, important to remember. There's legislation, and that can kind of take a while. The mayor can veto it. This mayor has never vetoed a bill, just by the way, but the mayor can kind of quash a lot of what the city council wants to do. But there is this ability to just draw attention and make an issue such that a mayor almost like has to respond because everyone's talking about it and pressuring him or her. So with that, I wanted to talk a bit about the upcoming elections. Excuse me. So the big race this year, and it's coming up in June. The primary election has been moved from September to June, is the race for mayor. And because the Democratic registration in New York City is, I think, 7 or 8 to 1, Democrat to Republican, it's most likely that the next mayor will be decided in that June primary. Sometimes I hear people say like, oh, I have to vote in November. It's really important for people who are registered with a party to vote in June, because that is basically when, that's when the election gets decided. People in New York can only vote, it's a closed primary. So Democrats have to vote in a Democratic primary, and people who are not affiliated with a party can't vote until November, but most people are registered as Democrats. And that is, as I said, most likely when the election will be decided. So that race is underway, and there are about 25, 30 people running for mayor. I mean, it'll whittle down, and I think there'll be maybe 5 to 10 serious contenders with money. But that race is kind of, it's begun already, but it's certainly going to get more and more contentious as the election draws near. There will be debates. There are forums constantly. The candidates participate, I'd say probably 2 or 3 times a week in forums, and they'll begin televised debates, and they're doing policy papers and so forth. So that's the main election. And it is, because de Blasio can't run again, it's really become a race it's a referendum on his record, which is, not been great according to many of the candidates running. So that's the main election. And then the city comptroller and public advocate, which are both citywide elected positions. Those are the 3 positions that are citywide, comptroller, mayor, and public advocate. They're both also getting open this year. So the current comptroller, Scott Stringer, is running for mayor. So there's a race for his seat. And the public advocate, Jumaane Williams, is running for re-election. Those 2 positions serve as something of a watchdog role, I would say. The comptroller financially, and the public advocate is kind of a blank slate to do whatever he or she feels is like important to the residents of New York. So those are interesting jobs. They kind of serve almost as a springboard for people who want to run for mayor or governor or Congress one day. And they also sort of serve to shed light on a lot of problems in the city. Scott Stringer has done a number of audits to showcase problems with like homeless shelters and public housing and real estate deals and so forth. Jumaane Williams, kind of much the same with policing and law enforcement. So those 2 positions, along with the city council, kind of serve as this huge, all-encompassing check against the power of the mayor's office. And then the city council, as I mentioned, 2/3 of those 51 seats will be open, and the other third, I think people are up for re-election. And there's also a number of district attorney, like in Manhattan, there's a pretty competitive district attorney's race. So with all of these races, there's, I think there's a lot of attention being paid right now, not just to the policies, but like sort of how politicians make the decisions that affect our everyday lives. And, turnout in New York City has historically been very low in these races. I think de Blasio won in 2013 with something like 22% of people voting. It's been very low. And in the recent years, because of a reaction to the current administration in Washington, there's been, kind of a renewed interest in local politics. And I think that I couldn't make a prediction for what turnout will be, but I sort of anticipate more people are getting involved, more people will vote, more people will make endorsements, and there's just going to be a greater interest all around. That sort of brings me to the next thing I wanted to discuss, which I think Deborah touched on a bit, is special interests in the role of real estate in this whole picture. So real estate is a huge underpinning of New York City, of course. Commercial and residential real estate is a major economic driver. It's how the city collects, property taxes are 1/3 of the city budget. And the decisions around real estate are really made in the most, among all of the decisions the city makes, I'd say real estate decisions are made the most democratically. Many people don't feel they're democratic, but the actual land use process accounts for community boards, borough presidents, a city planning commission, which is appointed by not just the mayor, but a number of other elected officials, and finally the city council. So that is a really kind of open process. It could, of course, be more democratic and more open, but that's not a singular decision. That's a really good example of one of the only things where people have a direct, other than voting, where people have a direct say in their government, because you really can't get a big project cannot just quickly get approved. Obviously things are negotiated behind closed doors, but neighborhoods and people have a real say in that process. Excuse me. And that is where the council holds the most of its power, because the city council is the final say in land use decisions. And the council generally defers to the member representing a given area. So, the Hudson Yards project was determined by the city council, but any land use changes that had to happen for that, the West Side of Manhattan council person voted on that. And so it's really important, I think, for people when deciding, who to elect and how to make these decisions, to think about the positions that person has on real estate, because that is where one's voice can really best be heard. And that's really where the most, it's just the most open process of all of the decisions that government makes. And of course, real estate affects everybody. Everyone has to live somewhere, work somewhere, get from A to B, shop somewhere, and all of those are land use decisions. And because of that, developers are what I would call probably the most entrenched special interest in New York. They, developers donate to basically any candidate they think is viable, because they want to have some good relationship with them for when that person is elected. I think they've done that with de Blasio and with all of the mayoral candidates. As a result of that, because there's sort of a concern many groups, certainly many good government groups have about, quid pro quos and pay to play, there are limits. The Campaign Finance Board puts pretty strict limits on how much a developer who's doing business with the city can give, but nevertheless, developers are kind of an entrenched special interest, and they're not going anywhere. Tech can go somewhere, even finance can pick up and go, but real estate is physical buildings. They can't go anywhere. So they want to have a say in the political process, in the elections, and then in the governing after those elections. Another group of, or another type of industry, so to speak, that has a big role in elections and in electing and in endorsements rather, are labor unions. So the city's unions have there's a long history of electioneering and advocacy. You'll see in the next few months, like the United Federation of Teachers, District Council 37, some of the private sector unions that represent building workers and hotel workers will get involved. And they've historically had a lot of sway over elections. De Blasio, for instance, was kind of a last place candidate for a while in 2013. And one of the most important endorsements he got was the 1199 Healthcare Workers Union. It's a big union with members that are very active at the polls. And of course, union leaders can tell their member, they can send flyers out within the union. So it's not just like advertising to the general public, but it's to their own members who vote, or who often vote. So those, I would say, are kind of seen as like the two main groups that influence politics in New York City: real estate and labor. And then bringing those people, bridging the gap between those interests and elected officials or lobbyists. There's many, many lobbyists in New York. It's a lucrative business, and some are very successful, and they represent like everybody. They're constantly in city. They're actually in the physical lobby of City Hall all the time, especially around the budget. You'll just, there's a whole swarm of them that hang around. They want to get their bills passed. They want their clients to, get FaceTime with the council members and so forth. And so that is, in a smaller town, it's not as significant of a business, I think, but in a place like New York, which is I always call it kind of like a big, small city, like everyone knows everyone in the political sphere, but it is, of course, a large, a huge city. For people to kind of get FaceTime with anybody they need, or they think they need, these lobbyists. So that's sort of the bridge between the external and the internal within the political world. So that's like a very quick kind of overview of who does what in City Hall and in the municipal building across the street from City Hall. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. One thing that, we discussed kind of briefly that I wanted to mention that's happening this year, it's really, really important and brand new, is ranked choice voting. It was, as Deborah mentioned, it was designed to sort of take the power away from these Democratic parties that for a long time had, they couldn't pick the mayor, but they can pick who gets put on the ballot certainly for judicial races, for the city council, the speaker of the city council. They have an enormous amount of influence. And over time, they were really designed initially to be democratic, and it was a way for people who might not otherwise have an avenue to get civically involved to have doors open. But over time, like all things with politics, it became seen as kind of stale and a little bit exclusionary to younger people who didn't have connections. I think one of the most striking examples of that was when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won. She didn't just defeat a congressman, she defeated the Queen's Democratic machine boss, Joe Crowley. And so over time, these county leaders have, increasingly lost power. And ranked choice voting is a real mark of, I think will be a real mark of the diminishment of their power. They won't be able to pick a candidate and kind of, they would do things like, they'd go to the Board of Elections and try to get opponents off the ballot, pick through, petitions, nothing untoward, just what you would do if you were, kind of part of a party machine. And that all becomes much less viable for them when you can choose your candidates. The way ranked choice works is you pick one, let's say there's 10 mayoral candidates, you choose your 5 favorites, rank them 1 to 5. And so somebody, let's say as an example, Maya Wiley, who's running for mayor, really wants to get Manhattan voters and thinks they'll go to Scott Stringer. She can campaign to be their number 2 choice. And if she is winning in many other districts, that being number 2 could carry her to the finish line. That is just an example. It's a hypothetical. But that makes the power of a county leader, a party leader, that much less so, because the number 2 person, is elevated through ranked choice voting. And so there have been a few efforts through legislation and through lawsuits to get rid of it. I think by people who think it won't help them, but it seems like the law, I'm sorry, let me correct myself. I don't think there's been legislation. There's talk of legislation and there was talk of legal action, but I think there was the beginnings of a lawsuit that seems to not be going anywhere. And I think it's a safe bet that ranked choice will be on the ballot in June. And so for people who are interested in learning more, I think the Campaign Finance Board and the Board of Elections are doing a lot of tutorials online. But I think basically it's you rank your top 5 candidates 1 to 5. And so that's going to change the race in ways that we can't really predict. But I think, and it will also change how people campaign. The sort of negative campaigning that goes on becomes less productive if you're trying to be somebody's second choice candidate. And then when somebody is in office, if they won through the ranked choice system, they're kind of less beholden to all of these special interests that used to dominate. So I think that's really interesting, and it's a real seed change. And I think that was sort of everything I wanted to cover. I'm happy to talk more about specific mayoral candidates, but maybe we could open it up to questions if anybody wanted me to talk about one particular thing.
Thank you, Sally. That was fantastic, wonderful, really insightful. So yeah, everybody, we're open to questions for Sally. Just throw them into the Q&A, and Deborah's going to ask them. So please, write your questions up, and lucky for us, Sally's going to take a few more minutes to answer them. So Deborah, have you seen a few already came in?
Good. Sally, we have a question about how influence over the Department of Education works.
That's a good question. I mean, because of mayoral control of the city school system, which was put in place, I don't remember the year it was put in place, but I think Bloomberg won mayoral control of the city school system. It had been a board of education, and long story short, I think he sort of felt that that was not functioning well, and that it was, he wanted total control and won it in the state legislature. To my point earlier, the state kind of really does control everything. So every few years, the state renews mayoral control of the city school system. And it has been one of the many things that Governor Cuomo and the state legislature has used as has kind of lorded over de Blasio during any number of arguments they've been in. But it is the mayor. The mayor has the ultimate control, appoints the school's chancellor. I mean, there's a parent council, but basically, by and large, it is the mayor, and I anticipate that is here to stay. I don't think that that's going anywhere, but it does have to get approved by the state legislature and the governor. So I guess you could argue that the governor has control in that way of the city school system, but the day-to-day operations is the mayor.
So that takes us to another question, which is about the role of unions, because the teachers union is obviously such an enormous influence in New York State. So you touched on it briefly, but I guess our questioner is wondering whether you think that unions have play a big role in stopping any, I guess, progressive initiatives or changes to the status quo.
Whether
they block initiatives or any sort of change to the status quo. Do you think that that's been the dynamic?
That's a great question. And I think that there are definitely people who feel that, unions, union leaders by and large are elected to represent their members, which sounds obvious, but I say that to say that, like, I think there's a belief that unions are very progressive and will always support progressive legislation. It's really the role of a union leader to represent the membership and do what's best. And so there's a tension between unions and progressive groups who want much more, much faster and more, like, not extreme, but wholesale changes to the system. Just one quick example of that tension would be the Amazon Economic Development Project in Queens. The progressive groups in Queens were against it. AOC was against it. It ultimately did not come here. And other than the Retail Workers Union, which had a self sort of interest in being against it because Amazon's not a unionized company, you saw all the big powerful unions in the city supported it. The teachers, the hotel workers, the building trades, the 32BJ, which is the building service workers. And the reason is that it was jobs for I think in the case of the teachers, it was like we're just going to be with this coalition and they'll be with us when we need them. But for everybody else, it was jobs, like they saw 32BJ's president at the time, who since passed away. He got a lot of flack from people on the left side of the Democratic debate for being, sort of what they felt was like against the progressive interests. But what he argued at the time was like, no, my members need jobs and they will get decent jobs through this. So it's not really for me to weigh in on whether unions are progressive or not, but that's the tension that plays out, and it plays out all the time: real estate, economic development, and any number of things.
So from your standpoint, where do you see the most promising initiatives coming from, progressive or not, I guess? And what are the factors that get from an idea to an execution of that idea? In other words, if there is all these tensions, what do you think are the most productive ways, I guess the questioner is asking, for these initiatives to start to get momentum and to move forward?
I think I'll go back for a minute to the land use process, and people really hate the land use process. So I'm sure that a lot of people would disagree with me if I say that it's very democratic, and it could be better. But the reason I think there's something good about it is that whether a development is good for a community or not, it really depends. It's a subjective decision. Certainly not for me to say as a reporter. But the crafting of a real estate deal involves the community board, the borough president, the city council member who's been elected by the residents of a district. And it's a very open process. And you've seen any number of times over the past few years, a community rose up against a development. Happened with Industry City in Brooklyn recently. It happened with Amazon, of course. It happened with a project in Inwood, Manhattan. And they had the ability and the power to change it or to kill it. And so I think that that is with understanding that obviously it's not perfect and some people feel these deals are kind of cooked before they ever get to the public, and there's something to that. Like they're not brand new when they're brought to the public. Things have been negotiated. But I think that that is a way to have a lot of input. I mean, democracy is messy. So when people have a say, things go on forever and people fight. And there's really no way around that because it's a messy process. The more people who are involved, the more opinions, the sort of, more caustic it could get.
I have a question about Diane Morales. Do you have any thoughts or ideas about Diane Morales?
Any thoughts about Diane Morales? So she's running for mayor as, I would say she's probably the most unapologetically progressive, liberal, whatever word you want to use, person in the field. One of, if not the most. She ran half of an affordable housing development company called FIPS, which is a nonprofit affordable housing developer, I think based in the Bronx. And she ran the community services aspect of it. And, she's an interesting candidate. She's got a lot, as I understand, and there'll be a campaign filing out Friday evening. Fun plans for me on Friday night. But anyway, she's got a lot of like small dollar donors in the Bernie Sanders model. And I think she's catching on with a number of people. I don't know that AOC will endorse a candidate. I don't know that the Democratic Socialists of America will endorse a candidate, but she would sort of be that natural candidate. She's a first time candidate, and I think she's a fresh face in this race. I have no idea whether she'll win or not. It's very hard to run for office, but she's certainly attracting a following.
I have a question that goes back, you mentioned real estate and unions, but another big economic piece of New York are the arts. So do you have any thoughts on sort of where they fit into this process?
For a long time, I think the cultural institutions were seen as a sort of happy place where, they have galas, everybody goes. Bill de Blasio doesn't go because he doesn't like anyone, and that's just a strange idiosyncrasy about him. But everybody, goes to the museum galas, everybody, for the large institutions. The city council gives grants to many arts institutions. And I think they're not really politically involved in elections per se, the way that unions and developers are, but they're very much part of the civic fabric of New York City, and both large and small. Because of COVID, unfortunately, we've seen that the arts have been decimated, Broadway, smaller theaters, probably more so than museums, dance theaters, so many of these institutions are hurting. And so I think what to do about the arts and how to revive the culture scene in New York is probably going to be part of the discussion in a way that it hasn't been in past elections. It was sort of understood that everybody kind of broadly speaking likes the arts, supports it, and that was all you really had to campaign on. It never really went that much deeper. But now there's a real conversation about how do you employ all of these people and how do you bring back this sector in the middle of a pandemic?
Is that which branch of government would be most involved in trying to make that happen? Is that the executive branch?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a combination. The executive branch would be in charge of any regulations and, large amounts of money that would go toward libraries and cultural institutions. The city council also has a discretionary budget that's, substantial. And I would imagine that there'll be a lot of public-private partnerships and, a lot of private sector people being, at the table, so to speak, in conversations about how to bring this piece of the economy back.
I'm going to switch gears. I have a question about whether or not you think New Yorkers will understand ranked choice voting and use it correctly.
I think from what I've seen and read, it's not too complicated. I mean, I think there is a concern and a valid one that there are people who are older who have been voting a certain way for a really long time who might be confused. And the Board of Elections is just not a terribly um, effective organization or entity in New York City. As this could be a whole separate panel discussion on that. So there's concern, and I think it's valid, about the role of the Board of Elections in disseminating information accurately, on time, and effectively. Ranked choice isn't terribly complicated. You're ranking 5 people, 1 to 5. So I think people will understand it, but I understand why there's concern about it, especially with the Board of Elections being in charge of a piece of it.
Who do you think RCV will, which positions do you think RCV will most affect, or will be most, will change the outcomes of the most? Will it be more the centralized, like the mayor, or do you think it will be more the local council members and borough presidents?
I really think it stands to affect everything. I definitely think it affects the mayor's race. There's no way it doesn't. There's so many candidates, and I think it'll have a big impact there. But I think it could impact city council races too. I think any race where where there's more than 2 people, ranked choice is going to have an impact. But yeah, the mayor's race for sure.
What do you think voters should look out for with this large changeover in both the city council and the new mayor in this next election?
Look out for in the government, you mean?
Yeah, what do you think the major changes might be likely to be, I guess?
I suppose it really depends on who's elected. I think one thing that de Blasio didn't do that everybody sort of seems unanimous, 2 things that everybody kind of agrees they want to do, is have a better relationship with the governor. I mean, that's tough. So to be fair to de Blasio, like, good luck. The governor's very tough. But that's one thing I think people are going to focus on, because politicians respond to public opinion, and public opinion shows New Yorkers are sick and tired of the governor and the mayor fighting all the time. And the mayor would argue, I have to say, because I always get told this whenever I write about it, that the governor holds all the cards and picks on him, and it's not really a fight so much as a bullying dynamic. So I think that will be addressed. I think there'll also be a lot more, depending on who's elected, I think you'll see a lot more partnership with the private sector. This mayor doesn't have a really good relationship with the private sector. It's a bit of a reaction to Bloomberg, who was all about the private sector, came from Wall Street, and was really much more, I think, comfortable in the private sector in some ways than in government. And this mayor is the exact opposite. So I suspect that we will see, because of that reaction, and just because of the necessity with COVID, there's a feeling that private interests have more money, can do things faster, can bring resources to bear in a way that government can't do alone. So those are 2 kind of broad things I think will change almost no matter who's elected.
So, in other words, you think that the current fiscal crisis will impact the issues in the sense that it's going to require the government to work more closely with the private sector?
Yes. Yes, not just the city budget itself, although that as well, but as you asked about culturals, that's like one good example, dealing with dealing with the private hospitals, the COVID relief, dealing with Washington, which is going to be a different dynamic now that it's a Democratic sweep in Washington. But those are always places where government has kind of typically relied on allies in the private sector for help. And so I anticipate there'll be more of that.
And do you think part of their task or their job, I don't know how to put this, would be to be attracting businesses to New York or back to New York?
That depends. It really depends on who you ask. I mean, I think some people, someone asked about Diane Morales earlier. There was a big story on her in the Root the other day, and she said something like, we don't want to go back to normal. Normal wasn't working. That's her view of New York City. So business is a broad thing that could mean your local, your corner store, and it could mean Goldman Sachs. So I think it depends. But New York City needs revenue. And so regardless of what type of business produces that revenue, I don't think anybody wants all business to leave New York City. Otherwise, property taxes will be very high because that's all that'll be left. So I think there'll be an emphasis on business. It depends on who's elected, whether that emphasis is big business or small, new or old, finance versus tech. That really depends on who's elected.
You think that those might be the dominant issues or the dominant discussion?
Economic recovery, yes. I think another thing we really didn't talk about, but it's very important to many voters, is criminal justice. That's sort of a separate, kind of a parallel crisis for much of last year. Was not a crisis in the way COVID was. I would call it more of a reckoning over, discrimination and injustice in the criminal justice system that has reached a point that I think anybody will be dealing with it. That will probably mean a new police commissioner. I think every candidate has said he or she would appoint a new police commissioner. In and of itself, that's just a normal thing to do. But there's a more loaded answer to that, which is like everybody's acknowledging that the general Democratic populace wants a fair criminal justice system. I think there will be changes in the police department as a result.
Is this a larger turnover than normal, since so many city council members seem to also now be running for other positions?
I think because of, so term limits was extended in 2009 from 2 terms to 3 and then brought back to 2 terms. So I think we're now on a cycle where every 8 years, most of the city council is up for I keep saying up for re-election, I'm sorry, leaves because of term limits. So I think this is what happens. This is the 8-year mark when 2/3 leave, and then in 4 years, the other third leaves. I mean, every 4 years they have to run, but I think this turnover is now normal because of the term limits change.
And then I have a question about whether you know of resources that are targeting jobs to find employment in the political arena.
I'm sorry, I lost half the quote. Could you just repeat that?
Right. So the question is asking, do you know of any resources that are targeted job boards for those who want to find employment in the political arena? I mean, I guess it means is that what kind of financial support are there for people who want to come into the political arena?
Oh, I see. Yeah, there are the political clubs, which I think you mentioned earlier, and there's many organizations that I think if I understand the question, if it's like sort of how does somebody who wants to is it about running for, is it about running for office or?
I'm honestly not sure.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, for people who want to run for office, there are candidate training sessions that, organizations like, there's a group called the Broad Room that was founded by a few de Blasio alumni women, and it's training women to run for office because there's a real gender imbalance, definitely in the city council. And, we've never had a female mayor. The council, I think, is not just predominantly male, like overwhelmingly male. So that's like one group just I can think of off the top of my head that does candidate trainings. In terms of people who just want to understand more about the system, like I said, the Campaign Finance Board is a pretty good resource. They put a lot online and they explain a lot really well. There will be a number of debates. And there are many, many forums where you can really find out more about candidates. I'm not sure if that's what the question was getting at, but those are certain ways to get involved or to just become more knowledgeable.
So this question goes back, I guess, to the previous question about turnover, right? So you're saying that there's a new normal so that every 8 years, 3/4 of the people change, right?
About 2/3, yeah.
2/3. Are you saying, do you think that in an ideal world, would all the appointed positions in legislative and executive branches be elected positions? Are more elected positions always better, or are there advantages to having such a deep appointed bureaucracy?
I mean, we live in a democracy, so that's just not going to change. And that's just, democracy is an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. There's no way the city council could be appointed or that a mayor could be appointed and then have the government of the city be as democratic as it is now. I think that there's an interesting question I've had over the years about the role of the city comptroller. it's like an auditor. And because it's an elected office and because this is a predominantly Democratic city, that position is held by somebody who wants to run for higher office. I think the last three comptrollers have all run for mayor: Scott Stringer, Bill Thompson, and John Liu. And I'm sure many, and Alan Hevis, it's a springboard for higher office. Because of that, the person who holds that seat has relationships with unions, relationships with developers, and an interest in maintaining those relationships for his or her elections in the future. And that kind of colors how city agencies are audited and how the city budget is assessed. So just to make that more real or tangible, Scott Stringer is close to many unions and wants their support in his mayoral run. That's normal. There's nothing wrong with that. But as a result, he's never going to say the city budget is bloated, you should lay off a quarter. And I'm not suggesting that he should say that, but if there were merit to that, he wouldn't say that because it would be politically devastating. So I think that there is an argument to be made for a position like that being, if not appointed, being somehow outside of the political process. But I can't see an argument for a mayor or a council being anything but elected.
So sorry, I'm trying to look for a segue and I can't find one, so I'm just going to switch. We have somebody asking, in your experience, I guess, of covering this process, which versions of public hearings seem to be more effective? And in this COVID era, how have you noticed or seen that changing, or where might people who want to in fact be involved in this process of public input look for effective ways to do that?
So I think city council hearings can be very effective. As I mentioned earlier, there are some really memorable city council hearings in my time covering city government. There was a hearing, like a sort of after the fact hearing after the 2010 snowstorm, which was, for anybody who was around then, probably remembers, it was really botched and it was a massive storm and the response was pretty terrible. And people were very upset. And the city council had a very memorable hearing, and I think not only got action, but really shed light on things that we wouldn't have known otherwise. They can command that people, deputy mayors and commissioners come and answer. You have to kind of meet your maker, so to speak, in that way. So and there's always a public panel at those hearings. So I think the city council, and to a lesser extent, but not less important, but maybe less high profile, community boards. Those are places, they're kind of tried and true places where one can, who wants to have some input or say over government can go. Community boards are really important when it comes to land use. They have a say and they shape the course of a land use project. They don't have a binding vote, but they begin the direction of the course of the conversation about a project. So those are two, pretty significant ways that somebody could get involved.
Have you been to any of the community board meetings during COVID, or covered any of the?
I've done more council than community board, I would say. I've covered a number over Zoom, and what I'm covering pretty much exclusively now is the mayor's race, and all of these evening forums are on Zoom. So I actually think because of Zoom, there's even more of them because there's no commuting time. So they're constant. And yeah, I cover them pretty consistently.
And have they changed? Has Zoom changed the way they happen?
Not really. I think there are more of them because, like I said, people can get to more of them. It's just more efficient without commuting. I think it's probably different for candidates because, candidates would hang around after and talk to people. If a candidate goes to a church, churches are a huge place to do, a popular place, I should say, to do politics. And, when it's on Zoom, you speak to the congregation and that's kind of it. I mean, you could do a Q&A the way we are now. It's not the same as in person. So I think it's probably more different for the candidates and the voters. They don't have that experience of questioning someone face to face or seeing them at a subway station, which is a common place people do electioneering. But for me, it's kind of the same.
Okay. And what if you're looking forward? I think we're winding down. I think, Sally, we have 5 more minutes. Is that right? we're writing down. If you, what's the one thing you'd want the membership listening here? What's the one thing you might want them to take away in terms of thinking about how they direct what precious time they have towards towards campaigning activities for the spring?
I think, I mean, simply the most important thing someone can do is be an educated voter. You know, as I mentioned, turnout in New York City is really low, and people constantly complain to reporters and everybody else, but I'm a reporter, so I hear it all the time, you know, like, how did we get this guy? Why do we have this person? So on and so forth. And it's like, that doesn't just happen. Like, I've been a reporter for 20 years. I have no idea who's going to be the next mayor. It really is an open question. I wouldn't even hazard a guess, you know? So people have a say in that, you know. And there are certain groups geographically and demographically that are very committed voters, and many that are not. And I think the most important thing someone can do is become an educated voter. Read up on the candidates, read up on ranked choice voting, since that's new, and just vote in that primary if you're in a party, and vote in the general.
Do you think
Okay.
that worked? Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Good.
No, there's one more question. Let's go for it.
Good. Just follow up, but go for it, Gina.
All right, well, I'm going to wrap it up then. Sally, thank you so much. I want to really thank you from the bottom of all of our collective DWC hearts for your important work on behalf of all New Yorkers. I also want to thank Kira Berry and Sally Greenspan for organizing this webinar. Rachel Curry for managing our tech, not an easy thing when some of us are all thumbs. Deborah Keats and Beatrice DeStefanis for creating the PowerPoint and its content, and Leslie Gersing and Beth Krieger for troubleshooting, advising, and generally keeping us all on task. So for all registrants here, we will follow up with you and send a copy of this webinar, which we hope you will share with anyone you know who doesn't know what the Comptroller does. Additionally, DWC will communicate with you as we analyze the candidates and settle on endorsements. Remember, every vote has cascading events and effects. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much for attending.
Night.
Night.
Thank you.